You guys are going to read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which is one of the most iconic, influential, important pieces of literature, a document ever written in American history. And I would like to think that you have some necessary historical context that you already sort of like possess that would help you sort of understand the significance of this letter, but I can't really assume that. This is just going to give you a little overview some of the factors surrounding his writing of this famous letter. First up, we have to look at Birmingham for you to understand sort of like what's going on in the background. Uh, Even by Dr. King's sort of estimation, Birmingham was maybe the most racist, segregated city in the entire United States in the early 1960s. So life for African Americans that lived in Birmingham was particularly tough. African Americans made up roughly 40% of the city's population of about 350,000. Despite the fact they made up 40% of the population, obviously a sizable chunk of the overall population, there were no African American police officers or firefighters, no African Americans within the city government themselves. So all of like the mechanisms of government were denied to African American participation. Additionally, economic opportunity was very like few and far between for African Americans in the city. There were no African American bus drivers, bank tellers, sales clerks, store cashiers. Really, any sort of employment for African Americans was largely limited to like manual labor positions. African Americans made up approximately 50 or made 50% of sort of like what white employees made. So there's a large pay gap. No surprise considering the types of jobs that were available to African Americans, and the unemployment rate for African Americans was roughly 2.5 times that of what it was for white workers. There was rigidly enforced segregation within the city, and only 10% of the city African American population were registered to vote. So, in terms of like economic and political opportunity, there was minimal. Additionally, Birmingham during this time period had received the nickname of Bombingham. Just incredibly racially motivated violence that took place within the city between 1945 and 1962, and this is probably like a light estimate. There were at least 50 unsolved bombings that were considered to be racially motivated within the city. There were no convictions for any of these. Churches were a prime target because that's where African American communities often met to like discuss civil rights issues at the time. And one neighborhood section within Birmingham became known as Dynamite Hill. It was an area in which there actually were whites and African Americans living within this community, and largely scene of attempts by white population members to drive these African Americans out. So, of the at least 50, there were more than a handful that just took place in this one section of Birmingham. So, again, a real bleak sort of atmosphere or environment if you were an African American living in Birmingham, Alabama in the early 1960s. Again, some historical context. Prior to sort of engineering this campaign in Birmingham, Dr. King had led a largely unsuccessful effort to desegregate Albany, Georgia. It failed for a couple of reasons. Number one, the scope of the movement. They tried to desegregate the entire city and they realized that was too much. Many of Dr. King's non-violent sort of protest sort of initiatives were sort of largely met by the Albany city officials with nonviolence. So it didn't create any sort of like confrontation that would have led to change. King determined that the campaign again was too broad and that he needed to focus on more particular areas. So he was eager to prove in Birmingham that just by focusing on sort of like the downtown economic center of Birmingham and then its government structure, that they would be more likely to achieve some sort of like success. The other major difference between Albany and Birmingham was that Birmingham was led by this individual, Bull Connor, who was the public safety commissioner. He was really in charge of the police department, the firefighters, like really all aspects of like public safety. And he was notorious for his racist views. and his harsh treatment of anyone that spoke out against like segregation. You can see this just in a real quick clip.
You can never whip these boys if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
And King was relatively certain that, unlike the protests in Albany, Georgia, that the Albany government officials largely met in a nonviolent way, that if they did similar protests in Birmingham, that Bull Connor was certain to like lash out against them. And they were looking to sort of achieve this confrontation, to draw attention to sort of the movement. So he was sort of like the perfect target within this movement because they knew he would respond back. The initial Birmingham strategy called for a boycotting of the downtown sort of Birmingham business center. And though initially the results were, pretty influential, business for some dropped as much as 40%. Change was still very slow to come. So they decided to just kind of like switch tactics and sort of up it a bit. And they switched over to what was called Project C, the C standing for confrontation. And this was much more like direct action. Sit-ins and kneel-ins in segregated portions of restaurants, public sort of like protests and marches calling for the end of discrimination, the end of segregation, and again, much more sort of like direct sort of like methods of protest. You can see King at the bottom of the picture sort of leading this. As a result of these direct sort of protests and this march, King violated a Birmingham city ordinance and was promptly arrested for leading this march. He was arrested on April 12th, 1963. This was King's 13th arrest, and he was placed in solitary confinement. While in solitary confinement, King was actually smuggled a letter that was written from 8 local clergymen, church leaders within Birmingham, that was recently published within a local newspaper. And parts of it read, "Responsible citizens have undertaken to work on various problems which cause racial friction and unrest. In Birmingham, recent public events have given indication that we all have opportunity for a new constructive and realistic approach to racial problems. However, we are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized, but we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. Just as we formerly pointed out that hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions, we also point out that such actions as to incite hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham. We commend the community as a whole and the local news media and law enforcement officials in particular on the calm manner in which these demonstrations have been handled. We urge the public to continue to show restraint should the demonstrations continue, and the law enforcement officials to remain calm and continue to protect our city from violence. We further strongly urge our Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders, and not in the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense." Essentially, these 8 religious officials from Birmingham basically saying, we have worked within the system, we acknowledge there's problems, we have made some improvement, and these protests that are being led by Dr. King are not helpful, and obviously urging people not to support them. This letter, signed by these 8 local religious leaders in Birmingham, Alabama, was sort of the impetus for Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. This 7,000-word letter that you can see is actually initially addressed to the original 8 clergymen that signed off on this letter that was published in a newspaper criticizing King and his protests. So that provides a little bit of context about what's going on in Birmingham and what King is directly responding to while King writes this letter in jail. Initially, just taking notes on the copy of the newspaper that was smuggled to him, and obviously then transforming it into the letter that you are going to read as part of our class discussions.